the Child and Family Counseling Center in Woodbridge, Virginia. I've been with them since about 1990. I've been doing this for a while. I work with kids, teens, adults, families on various issues: ADHD, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, family conflict, things like that. One of the things I do in my spare time is I write self-help books for kids. I'm going to use the nifty share screen thing, and I will show you a little bit of what I do. Some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today is from my book, What to Do When You're Scared and Worried, through Free Spirit Publishing. They're a great publisher. I'm a big believer that if you teach kids how to handle their feelings, you can go a long way towards preventing problems later on. So I think that is, I think it's so important, because if you address it early on, you can prevent a lot of problems that happen later, especially when you give kids the coping strategies. One of the things I've done during the pandemic is worked on my next book, which is actually coming out soon. It's called What's the Big Deal About Addictions? Answers and Help for Teens. And so one of the things that I've noticed is that addictive behaviors have gotten worse during the pandemic. People are trying to escape. So whether it's through video games, whether it's through social media, Instagram, you name it. And as you probably know, kids will be up at 2, 3 in the morning if you let them, doing this kind of stuff. So I think it's really, really important to keep an eye on it. Let's go back to the regular screen. What I'll just do is stop that and get back. All right. Still learning how to do this here. For some reason, stop share. Okay. There we go. That's better. Can you guys see me all right?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, okay, I see everybody now. And you can see me, so that's good. So worries and fears are common in children. Most kids go through a period of time when they're experiencing some degree of anxiety or fear. You know, it's developmentally normal. But for many kids during this situation with the COVID-19, their anxiety has just gotten a lot worse. You know, the fear of getting sick, uncertainty of not knowing when it will end, not being able to visit with family and friends, being stuck at home, not being able to play sports, participate in plays, loss of income. All these things have taken a toll on us. And again, with kids with anxiety disorders and parents with anxiety disorders, I think that can make it a lot worse. So one of the things I want to do today is to talk a little bit about some of those. Let me get back to the first one here. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about anxiety and some of the effects that it can have later on. One of the things we know is if you don't treat anxiety early on, you can have consequences such as school absences, where kids are afraid to go to school. A lot of these kids with anxiety disorders as teenagers will drop out because they're too scared to go. And I assume this is going to be worse once actually in-person learning happens. Impaired peer relations. If you are an anxious kid, it's going to be hard for you to make new friends. It's going to be hard for you to try out for teams, things of that nature. A lot of these kids are they're left by themselves at lunchtime. I see a lot of kids who feel really upset and lonely because nobody comes up to them. Low self-esteem. If you are anxious and you are afraid to do a lot of things that other kids your age are doing, it's pretty normal that you're not going to feel so good about yourself. And so one of the things we see is that depression will come into play after that as a result of untreated anxiety. Addictive behaviors to self-medicate. And we know that even overdoses are increasing as a result. Workplace problems. And of course, anxiety disorders in adulthood. That if you don't treat it, it can create all sorts of problems down along the line. So it's really important to try to address this early on. So what I'd like to do in today's talk is I'm going to talk about some of the effects of COVID-19, what we know, which again keeps changing, the prevalence of anxiety in children, some of the causes of anxiety. I'll talk a little bit about the fight, flight, or freeze response, some of the symptoms of anxiety disorders, how we diagnose them, some parental factors that you should be aware of in case you are inadvertently making your child's anxiety worse. Some COVID-19 parenting strategies. I think it's helpful to give you some information on how to talk to kids about it, what kind of questions to ask. Sometimes you might think, well, I don't want to bring it up if I just going to make them feel worse. But usually talking about it makes it better. How to teach coping strategies to kids, and then when professional help is needed. And what I'm thinking with the talks, we'll keep an eye on the chat box and whatnot. you probably don't want to have me just talk for the entire time. So we'll periodically take a break and answer some questions if everybody's okay with that. All right. So let me talk a little bit about some of the statistics. I'm sure you've heard tons of numbers being thrown about. I'm not going to give you the exact latest numbers because, again, they keep changing. But I want to give you a sense of the perspective, okay? So we've got about 6.7 million cases in the United States alone, and about 40,000 new cases are showing up a day. Part of this is the result of increased testing. Part of it is the result of increased exposure. We're still probably going to experience the effects of people going on vacations, for example, during Labor Day weekend. Total US deaths, now over 200,000. Virginia cases total, 140,000, 3,000 deaths. Cases per 100,000, that gives you a sense of just how prevalent the disease is in a particular area. So obviously the higher per 100,000, the more concerned, the more spread there is, and the more careful you have to be in terms of limiting exposure. Prince William County, total cases, 12,000 approximately, 901 hospitalizations and 201 deaths. The other figure that you may hear about is the positivity rate. Let me just mention that. And this is the 7-day average positivity rate in Virginia. That what we look at is depending on how many tests, if you're doing 100 tests, 7.6 of them are going to come back positive. So that gives you an idea of the rate of infection as well. What we're looking at in terms of like reopening of different things, you want to get that positivity rate low enough so that we are finding, okay, it's not spreading as rapidly. So then it's safer to reopen. Some of the things that we know, COVID-19 is very contagious with close contact. We think that, so you may have heard a couple different things, that we think that in close proximity, you have to be exposed for about 10 to 15 minutes before you can actually transmit the virus. That's why very brief contact is probably less risky. Longer contact is more risky. Primarily transmitted through respiratory contact, possibly airborne. There have been some studies that they've shown where you're in a restaurant in close quarters. And you can see, I don't know if you guys have seen some of these videos where the droplets can spread because some of them can stay in the air. That's still, under study. Less so on surfaces. It doesn't seem to, even if you're touching something that somebody else touched, there needs to be a certain amount of the virus and it actually deteriorates very quickly. Again, you want to be careful, but sometimes it's a little bit reassuring to realize that you don't have to panic every single thing that you do. We know that asymptomatic people can transmit the virus. That's one of the things we're concerned about, even with kids. Kids are less likely to get sick from it, but they may be as likely, if not even more likely, to transmit it to others. Older people are more at risk. People with chronic illnesses are more at risk. You can see below a couple points here. About 75% of the kids who have died had an underlying condition. So we know that that puts you at greater risk. There's higher rates in people of color, Latinx people as well. We're not quite sure what that's about. It may be higher levels of certain chronic conditions such as diabetes. It may also, another theory is that people might be more likely to live in closer quarters. So obviously transmission would be more likely in that case. Again, most people who are infected show minimal or no symptoms. And I think the thing to kind of keep in mind here is that as bad as it looks, your actual individual risk of contracting it, unless you're in a situation like a hospital where there's a high concentration of people with it, is still fairly low. The problem is if you or somebody you love or know gets infected, even then the chance of serious illness is low. But for a number of people, it is very severe, obviously. So you want to try to keep that in mind and as you're making your own decisions. And we know that being outdoors is safer, more dispersal of the virus. Loud talking, heavy breathing, singing, all aid in transmission because you're expelling air more forcefully. Singing is one of the issues in churches and things like that, because if you're singing, you're obviously transmitting a lot if you're infected, so you got to be careful with that. Bottom line, again, take appropriate precautions, but remember there are reasons to be hopeful too. There are a ton of studies going on all over the world. I think in a way that's unprecedented. There's a number of vaccines that are now in phase 3 trials. So again, there are reasons to be hopeful. I don't know that we're going to get a safe and effective vaccine before the end of the year, but we'll see what happens. Now, in terms of how kids may react to COVID-19, kids have a harder time making sense of the pandemic. And that's not so surprising if you think about it, because kids don't have the ability to understand things like numbers, for example. They tend to be egocentric. Everything sort of revolves around them. And so they are probably going to take things to heart. You're going to probably see an increase in fear, sadness, worry, behavior problems. So one of the things that you need to keep in mind, if your kids are starting to misbehave more, to just ask, okay, well, what's prompting this? Is it the stress of virtual school, for example? Is it stuff that they're seeing online that's scaring them? Because it's as much as you try to monitor what kids are seeing, it's difficult. You give them an iPad or a laptop to go on school, they're going to try to go other places. Now, if you have kids who have an anxiety disorder or other psychiatric disorder, they're at higher risk of having problems as a result. Presence of other recent stressors. Obviously, if you have a parent who's lost their job or lost income, that's a huge amount of stress. So try to monitor their sleep and eating habits, how well they're focusing. For the teenagers, be aware of possible indications of substance abuse. I've definitely seen increases with that. And obviously the importance of parents in helping kids cope. Keep in mind that kids take their cues from parents. So monitor what you're watching, monitor what you're sharing with them. And I'll give you some more ideas about parenting as we move along. Okay, let me talk a little bit about common childhood fears. As I mentioned earlier on, they're normal. Separation, and it varies based on their age. So, and it also varies on developmental level. For example, preschoolers their common fears are separation from parents, the dark, monsters, bad weather, loud noises, people in costumes, clowns, things like that. And kids don't have the ability to really think about it. Even a costume, they can't think that, oh, there's just a human person behind the costume. But they have a harder time with that. Things that are in the dark, again, that's pretty normal as well. When you go into elementary school, failure, whether it's sports, other activities, or school, peer rejection is big. Being teased, fears of separation from parents, and fear of death. And obviously that's heightened with COVID-19 as well. Now, as they get older, like some of these fears, like separation from parents or the dark, monsters, obviously that gets better over time as kids mature. Moving on to middle schoolers, bullying. I think bullying tends to peak in middle school. It usually gets better in high school as kids mature. Being rejected by your peers, worries about health, and of course grades. High schoolers are now worrying about the future, dating, self-image, career. Grades opening up to parents is difficult. And obviously now, in terms of going into a profession or going to college or whatnot, a lot of kids just don't know what the right thing to do is. And I'm sure as parents, if you have kids who are going to college and doing it virtually or in person, it's stressful for everybody. So when you're looking at anxiety, one of the things that you need to think about is in terms of when should you be concerned? When should you say, okay, there's a problem here? When we're diagnosing anxiety disorders, we're looking to see if the anxiety is excessive for a person's age and circumstances. So again, fear of the dark at age 11 or 12 is more concerning than at age 4 or 5. So again, when the fears persist beyond what's normal for the age, when they cause problems in functioning. So if you are anxious, but you're able to get yourself to do things, that's okay. But if you're so anxious, you can't even, go outside to, introduce to a friend, or you're so afraid of being hurt that you're not willing to try out for a sport, even though you have an interest in the sports. If you're so anxious that you can't get yourself to go to school, I'm sure you've all worked with kids who are terrified and parents trying to get them out of the car into the school. It's very sad to see because their level of panic is so extreme. If the anxiety is a source of distress for the child or the family, that's an indication of a problem. Some kids might be a little shyer and they're okay with not having many friends, where other kids, they really take it to heart and feel really bad about themselves that no one seems to like them. And then of course, if it's contributing to other mental health issues. And so if your anxiety is say you already have depression or obsessive compulsive disorder or autism, and then anxiety on top of that, those can act sort of synergistically. So each makes the other worse. So that's one of the other things we look at is, if it's contributing to other issues, to take a look. One of the things we're finding now as well with COVID is that some of the kids who've been stable for a long time, they're starting to crack. And so it's really important to get them some help. And I'll talk about some of that, some of the things you can do in a little bit. What anxiety feels and looks like. Anxiety takes different forms for different people. And so there's just a number of different things. You've got some thoughts here, you've got some physical symptoms, worrying about the future. Kids with anxiety disorders tend to worry about things way beyond their years. They don't need to worry about getting a job after college if they're 7 years old, for example. We've got things like restlessness, lightheadedness, panic attacks, second guessing, wanting reassurance, always wanting reassurance from you that things are going to be okay. And that's difficult because you don't always know either. So, and again, I'll talk about that more in a little bit. So anxiety disorders are pretty common. They're one of the most common psychiatric disorders. You think about, research actually says that 13 out of every 100 kids or teens or so do have a diagnosable anxiety disorder. They're more common in girls. About 50% have a co-occurring disorder. And what that means is that you have two disorders. So if you have anxiety, half the people who have anxiety may also have depression or OCD or ADHD or autism. And so again, both disorders have to be addressed if you're going to treat it successfully. I think there's about a lifetime risk of anxiety disorders. 25% of people over their lifetime will at some point be diagnosable with anxiety disorder. Some do get better over time. All right. Any questions so far? I haven't seen the chat box here, so I think we're good. Yeah, all right. Not yet, so that's good. All right, so let me go on to some origins of anxiety here. The fight, flight, or freeze response. One of the things that's really helpful for, oh, hold on a second here. Got three. Okay. I really, yeah, I'll answer those questions in a little bit. So anxiety is designed to protect us. And one of the things that we need to be able to convey to kids is that anxiety is a good thing. If we didn't have anxiety, we would not have survived as a species. So the fight, flight, or freeze response is what is designed to keep us safe. So what that means is that if your body, if your brain senses danger, your body gets ready to either fight the danger, flight, which is run away from it, or freeze, try to hide and hope that whatever's chasing you is not able to catch you and have you for their dinner. It's also an energy conservation mechanism. What I mean by that is that, that your body has a lot of energy that it sort of keeps in reserve. So it also allows you to go out your daily business. If you're going to work, if you're doing daily tasks, but if you sense danger, in a split second, your body sinks into gear. So the sympathetic nervous system activates this response, gets you ready to, gets your muscles tight, gets your heart pumping, breathing so that you're ready to take action. Afterwards, once the danger is past, the parasympathetic nervous system deactivates that system. That's what allows you to relax, to chill out, calm down, so that you're able to get back to normal. So one of the things here, and I'll talk about this in a minute as well, is exercise actually tricks the nervous system, the brain, into thinking that the danger is past. Because if you're running, if you're doing something physical, your brain reacts as if, okay, we've done the fighting. So then what happens is that exercise activates that parasympathetic nervous system. So that's one of the reasons why we encourage kids with anxiety to get exercise regularly, because it helps to deactivate that. Just a little brain structure involved in dealing with fear and stress. I just want to point out a couple things here. See the amygdala? The amygdala is sort of like your fear switch in the brain. So what that does is gets you ready to fight or run away. What it also does is when that switch is activated, that prefrontal cortex, which is your thinking part of your brain, that should have control over the more instinctual parts of the brain, that part of your brain gets shut off because you don't need to think when you're in danger. What you need to do is react instinctively. And of course, the problem with that is today's dangers, today's worries and stresses don't really lend themselves to running away or fighting. That doesn't really help. And so one of the things we try to do when we're treating anxiety is we want to figure out how to keep that prefrontal cortex on so that fear switch doesn't get triggered. And we do that by changing thoughts, which we'll get to in a little bit. I'm going to skip this a little bit. Brain SPECT imaging, it's one of the ways we look at anxiety. Just really briefly, the brains on the right are more normal brains. Up top, this red part here that you see at the bottom, the one to the right, further down, you see some areas of the brain are red. That means there's more activity in those parts of the brain. So to translate this, it basically means that when you're anxious, your brain is working overtime. You think of, obsessive thinking. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if I get sick? What if mom gets sick? What if we lose our job? All that kind of stuff. That's like an endless loop of thinking. And that is part of what happens with anxiety. So we get this experience of anxiety. We got physical sensations, which is like headaches, stomach aches, butterflies in the stomach. Those are physical. Emotions, feeling nervous, worried, fearful. Those are more emotions that you experience. But then there's the thoughts. And the thoughts are the what ifs. What if this happens? What if this happens? What if that happens? I can't handle this. It's going to be a disaster. It's going to be the end of the world. But if you're telling yourself that, it just makes it worse. So one of the things we do in treating kids is we want to help them challenge those thoughts and dispute or disagree or argue against the irrational or contributing thoughts. For example, if you have somebody who's afraid of failing a test, and you ask them, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen if you fail the test? Okay, is that going to mean your life is over? Okay, no. Does that mean you're going to get a bad grade? Well, yeah, you'll get a bad grade. So is there anything that you can do? Anything that you can do that would minimize the chances? Okay, maybe I could study more a little bit. And so when you're thinking yourself through and say, okay, I can only do my best, that is a way that kids can help keep that anxiety under control. And to teach them before they even go into the test, to say, hey, I'm just going to do my best. That's all I can do. I just have to, if I don't do well, that just means that I didn't learn it as well as I thought, and I need to study more next time. Let me talk briefly about anxiety disorders. So there's a number of different anxiety disorders we have. I'm not going to go into all the criteria. If you have kids already diagnosed with some of these, this won't be a surprise to you. Generalized anxiety disorder basically is people who worry about a lot of different things. And as a result of their worry, they may have sleep disturbance, they may have appetite disturbance, they may feel tense a lot of the time, they may have trouble sleeping. That's a fairly common thing. Then you have a strong need for reassurance. They're always wanting you to tell them that things are okay. Separation anxiety is, just as it sounds, this is a fear of being separated from parents. One of the things about anxiety disorders to keep in mind is that anxiety disorders, when you have separation anxiety disorder, it means that you're afraid that something bad's going to happen that's going to prevent you from reuniting with your parents. For example, let's say your parents are out on, date night or something like that, back when those things were more possible. You're afraid that they're going to get into an accident, they're not going to come back home. Or you're afraid if you're going to go to school, something bad's going to happen that's going to separate you. And so that's why kids cling to their parents. They're really terrified that something bad's going to happen. Specific phobias are based on experiences generally. So let's say you got bit by a dog when you were younger, and that generalizes. And so now you have a dog phobia. So any dog that you see, you automatically have this anxiety response, fear. You're assuming, you're thinking, you're expecting that dog is going to attack, that every dog is going to attack you, which of course is not the case, but it generalizes. And so what people do with phobias is they tend to avoid the situation, which is what happens with social anxiety disorder. Kids with social anxiety disorder are afraid of interacting with other people. They're afraid of not being accepted. They're afraid of doing something embarrassing, something that will be humiliating. For example, let's say they try to say something or tell a joke and people are laughing at them. Or let's say you're in gym class and you make a mistake and you're afraid everybody's going to laugh at you. And so what you do is you avoid social situations because you're afraid that it's not going to go well. You don't know what to say. You get tongue-tied. You don't know how to start a conversation. A panic disorder, these are people who have panic attacks. And one of the things about a panic attack is the physical reaction where you feel like you're going crazy because your head's pounding, your stomach's hurting, your muscles are tight. You may feel like the things are spinning, and you feel like you're kind of going crazy. And it is very scary. When your heart's beating fast during a panic disorder or panic attack, some kids are worried about having a heart attack. Even when we tell them you're not likely to have a heart attack, you're too young for that. Sometimes these kids end up in the emergency room because they don't believe you. And one of the things that happens with panic disorder is agoraphobia. And so if you're afraid of having panic attacks, especially when you're away from home, you're afraid to go out. So agoraphobia is a fear of being outside. Often that goes along with panic disorder, not always. But again, the fear is that you're going to be outside somewhere where you can't control and you're going to have this panic attack. Obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, you either have obsessions, compulsions, or both. Obsessions has to do with repetitive thoughts, and that's the what ifs. What if this happens? What if that happens? These are people who may have to count things or check things repeatedly. And they can't turn those thoughts off. Is this safe to eat? Is this safe to eat? Is this contaminated? Is this surface contaminated? Do I need to wash my hands 20 times to make sure that I've washed anything off? And that leads to the compulsive part. The obsessive part of it is the thoughts. The compulsive part is the behaviors. And so if you are afraid of getting infected or just germs in general, and you wash your hands for 20 seconds and you think, well, maybe I missed something. So you wash it for another 20 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes. These kids often will get chapped hands because they're washing so much. And obviously that can cause problems. Generally, to diagnose OCD, you want to see these obsessions and compulsions taking about an hour or more a day. A lot of times people kind of goof around saying, oh, I'm a little OCD. You know, a little OCD isn't really a disorder. It may keep you more organized, which is not a bad thing, of course. But people with OCD, it really becomes a problem. They can't go anywhere. They can't go to a friend's house because they're afraid of getting sick or touching things. They don't even want, some of these kids don't want kids to come in their house because I don't want anybody to touch anything in my room because they're going to contaminate it. And then I got to decontaminate it every time. And of course, COVID-19 feeds into that pretty clearly. Post-traumatic stress disorder, that's if you've had a traumatic situation occur and you're afraid of that recurring. And what happens with PTSD is you have flashbacks. So maybe, give you an example. Let's say you were in a car accident and you were safe and that's okay, but it was pretty traumatic. And then you're riding the bus to school back when that was possible. What happens is that you're afraid of that's going to happen again. So you may have a flashback, so your body reacts as if it's happening all over again. Hoarding. Hoarding isn't specifically an anxiety disorder. I put it in here simply because hoarding is about anxiety. The anxiety is that you're going to need something that's in your house that you don't want to throw away. And so in times like these, there's more hoarding. I mean, some people are trying to get rid of stuff, which is great, but other people are afraid, well, what if they run out of hand sanitizer? What if we run out of this? What if we can never go to the store again? So they, hoard things to try to keep themselves safe. I mean, think of like a squirrel hoarding nuts, for the winter, and if you don't get enough, you're going to die. That's how a lot of people think about it. Causes of anxiety disorders, there are psychological ones, psychodynamic, behavioral. Give you a quick example. If you have say you have parents who are having some issues and the child develops an anxiety disorder, forcing the parents to try to work together, there may be some element of that where the child is reacting maybe more unconsciously to something else that's going on. Behavioral part of that is experience. Like the example I gave you before, if somebody has been bitten by a dog or a bug, a bee, whatever. And so then you develop this fear as a result of your experience. Genetic, we know that there's a higher incidence if there's a family history. So if you have a child who's anxious, chances are there's a parent, a grandparent, a sibling, aunt, uncle who also has anxiety. One of the reasons we think this has a heritability here is also we see some biological components of anxiety and dysregulation of neurotransmitters, including these three: serotonin, GABA, and norepinephrine. Very basically, neurotransmitters are brain chemicals that the nerve cells use to communicate with each other. The thought is that for some people, they may not have enough of, say, serotonin. And so what happens is they're more likely to get anxious in situations. And when you give medication, for example, medication often increases the level of serotonin in the brain, allowing the brain to kind of calm down and relax, which also can allow you to do things differently. These other two neurotransmitters are also involved. So medications change those things. Now, we also know, and there's actually some interesting studies that show that psychological therapy, counseling, can also change how the brain works. So it's not just medication, that you can actually demonstrate that. So, and again, not everybody needs medication, obviously. Basic temperament, shyness. We know there's some kids who are shy from the very beginning. They tend to withdraw from people. And again, that's sort of inborn temperament. Doesn't mean you can't change it or modify it, but for some people, it's just kind of a natural tendency. In terms of diagnosis of anxiety disorders, this sort of repeats a little bit of what I've talked about earlier. Symptoms have to persist over time, usually 6 months or more, depending. For PTSD, it's like 1 month or more. It's got to start within 1 month of the trauma. Got to have impairment in functioning. There's a fear inventory from my book, What to Do When You're Scared and Worried. If you're interested in that, I can send it to you. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll have a child fill it out, and they just check different things that they might be afraid of. And the nice thing about doing something like that is kids may not tell you specifically what they're afraid of, but if you give them a list of things, you may find that they've been thinking about things that you had no idea that they were thinking about. A clinical interview with child and parents. So that's the initial session. We would work with the kids and the parents. What I do is I always meet with the child first, unless the child is too afraid to do that. So I want to see what they'll tell me, because again, often kids, if you ask the right questions, especially if they're not worried about parental reaction, they may open up and tell you more. Because a lot of times kids are very aware of not wanting to upset their parents. Rating scales can help. Part of our evaluation. Again, we have parents do ratings, children do ratings, and then we can compare your ratings to other kids who have these disorders to see how severe the problem is. Psychological testing is sometimes used as well. That's often helpful if you think there may be more than one thing going on. That maybe you have anxiety that's manifesting in school, but really what's going on is there's maybe some underlying ADHD, or maybe there's a learning disorder, or maybe there's some other things going on that are actually impacting school functioning. So by doing some testing, that can help clarify that and give you a better sense as to where treatment needs to go. Projective testing has to do with things like the ink blot test or storytelling test. That some kids will see a lot of scary things and report those, which gives you a sense of what might be on their mind. Again, can be very useful in helping you understand and treat that. All right. Parent factors that contribute. Being an anxious role model. If you are anxious yourself and your kids see you being terrified of certain things, they're going to pick up on that. Reacting critically to your child's fears. If you sort of brush them off or tell them, hey, you need to be worried about that, that can make it worse as well, because then they feel that it's not okay to have worries, and so they don't come to you. Being overprotective or a helicopter parent. So for this, helicopter parents are those who are so afraid of their child getting upset that they will do whatever they can to prevent them from experiencing the consequences of their actions. The problem with that is that the message that you are inadvertently sending is that your child is not capable of handling it, and that they need you to prevent them from experiencing the consequence. For example, parents who are up late at night doing homework with kids because they don't want their child to get a bad grade. I hear this a lot, especially if you see your child stressing at the last minute. But again, what does that teach them? That you're going to bail them out in the end, and they don't learn how to plan ahead. That sometimes it's better to have them experience the bad grade, for example, because that is a natural consequence that occurs as a result of not doing your work. And that may motivate your child to do things differently the next time. Being overly punitive or authoritarian in your parenting style, that you want your kids to respect you, but you don't want them to be afraid of you. And if the punishments are so great each time, what happens is that they try not to get caught, or they try not to get themselves in trouble. But if it's too much that way, then they're not going to tell you when they're having trouble either. And that's the concern, that you want them to be able to come to you and talk with you about it. This is especially important as they get older. So if you've got teenagers, for example, and they're running into trouble with, maybe addiction, maybe Maybe it could be stealing, it could be vaping, it could be sexual activity, it could be many different things. And so you want them to be able to come to you and say, hey, I messed up, or I got drunk with some friends here. I know I said I wouldn't do it, but this is what happened. And if they can come to you, there's a chance that you can address it in a constructive way. You don't want them to be afraid to come to you when it really counts. Mental health or addictive disorders in parents, that certainly contributes. So that's why it's so important for parents, if you have these issues yourself, to try to get help for that, because it's hard to help your kids with these things if you're suffering from the same thing. At the same time, you can also use that in a more positive way to be able to say, hey, I understand that you're really afraid about this. I'm afraid too, and this is what I do to cope. That way they don't feel quite so alone. Stress level to parents, obviously, when you're under higher levels of stress, it's going to create more tension with everybody. All right. Any questions so far? I don't see anything with the, hold on a second. Yeah, I don't think I'm seeing anything. Let's see. Just a second here. All right, so we don't have any questions yet. That's good. Y'all can still hear me, hopefully. All right.
Yes.
Good. I'm just double checking. Go back here. All right. So let me talk about some parenting tips for COVID-19. These tips are also good in general, but I'm going to try to make this a little bit more specific, and then I'll run through some of the general strategies for anxiety before we take any further questions. So one of the things you want to do is you want to welcome your kids' questions. So much in the air, kids are bound to have questions that they may not be asking, okay? They might think it's silly, or they don't want to worry you. It could be something that, is somebody going to die if we, go visit them? It could be something as simple as, my favorite, store or a restaurant or whatever going to close. So encourage them to ask. So that what you want to do is have them feel like they're being heard. And you probably have to go to them. They may not come to you. So, and I'll tell you some specific ways of asking in just a little bit. Don't avoid questions you can't answer. If your child asks you, hey, when is this going to be better? And you don't necessarily say, we don't know yet. This is what we're doing, but we really don't know. And that's hard to not know. Set the emotional tone when discussing. If your anxiety happens to be particularly high in a particular moment, that's probably not the best time to have a conversation with your child. So you might want to wait until you're a little bit calmer yourself. Going into modeling calmness. Kids are perceptive, they're sensitive to your behavior, they pick up on your anxiety. So again, monitoring your own feelings and reactions. Be developmentally appropriate. So one of the things in terms of just answering questions for kids in general, especially anxious kids, don't give them more than they need. So if you have like a 6-year-old and you say, okay, well, yes, people can catch COVID-19. This is why we wash our hands. This is why we wear masks, okay? Well, can I get in the air? Well, as far as we know, we don't know, but it's better to be outside. So give them as much information as they want. If they're a little bit older, they may have more specific questions. So, for teenagers do research online. That can have some negative results. A lot of my teenage clients with addiction issues, they find these websites that tell them how to use LSD and how to microdose to go on trips and things like that. And they think because they've seen it online, it's okay. As we know, that's not always the case. So one of the things with the older children, ask them, hey, where are you getting have you been looking for information at all? What have you read or heard? What do you think about that? And maybe even do some research with them together if need be. Take cues from your child, again, inviting them to ask, whatever things are whatever comes to their mind. And so if you take your cue and you're looking at them and you see them a little bit more worried, to be able to say, hey, you seem a little bit down lately. What's going on? Are you having any thoughts or feelings that are upsetting you or concerning you? There we go. Listening actively to feelings and questions. So one of the things you can do is basic reflective listening. One of the things they teach couples when you're doing couples counseling, and it's great for kids. you'll say, okay, so what I hear you saying, honey, is that you're feeling really sad that you're not able to see your friends, and you see some other kids playing with their friends, and you feel kind of left out because we as your parents don't feel comfortable with you doing that yet. Okay, well, thanks for telling me how you feel. I understand that. And that's the acknowledge and validating a child's feelings. Because if you just do that, that action alone can help them calm down a little bit. Because when you feel understood, you can relax a little bit because you feel like, okay, now somebody understands and gets what I'm coming from. Now, helping a child sit with anxiety, that's not an easy thing to do. Because sometimes what we do in terms of dealing with anxiety or unpleasant things as a whole is we just want to escape. We just want to not think about it. And that's normal, and there is, that can be a helpful coping strategy as well, but you don't want to over-rely on that. That anxiety is part of life. There are certain things that you're going to be anxious about, but there really aren't any great solutions. Whether it's, COVID, whether it's, grades, whether it's the financial situation, whether it's politics, which we won't even get into. That's a whole other series of issues that are causing a great deal of anxiety for people on all sides. So sometimes you just have to sit with it and say, hey, sometimes we just don't know. And so we're doing the best that we can. That's where you also can limit, your exposure to different things. That's where also you can do relaxation strategies like deep breathing. So if you have somebody who's feeling anxious and you say, okay, well, let's do some deep breathing together, some belly breaths. There's some wonderful apps out there. There's, YouTube videos. Some of the kids tell me they go to YouTube videos and they listen to it. It might be something peaceful, relaxing beach noises to help them reduce it. Because what you're actually trying to do is when you get anxious and you're doing relaxation exercises, you're basically training your body to calm down. So that next time you feel a little bit anxious and you practice those relaxation exercises, your body is more efficient in its ability to calm yourself down. So what you're doing is you're sitting with anxiety, and over time it gets better. This is akin to what we call exposure therapy. So if you have somebody who's afraid of a dog, for example, and you go outside and there's a dog there and your child sort of recoils, and you just talk calmly and you soothe your child. And over time, you're still in the situation, your child might feel a little bit more comfortable reaching out a little bit, because the longer you're there, the more your brain says, hey, wait a minute, I'm still in this dangerous situation. My brain is telling me, my amygdala is telling me this is scary, but nothing bad's happening. So maybe it's okay. One of the things I do with kids in terms of when they go back to school, the kids with separation anxiety and they're afraid, I recommend that before school starts, they go to the school. Maybe even the parent pretends to drop them off. Hey, have a nice day. They walk up to the door. They come back in your car. You drive around the block and you do the same thing, maybe 5, 10, 15 times. It's kind of funny after a while. But what you're doing is you're trying to, again, desensitize them to the situation. So when the time comes for them to actually go in, they're going to do better. And so you may want to do this when schools do reopen. If you have a child who's too afraid to even step foot into school, expose them to it a little bit at a time so that they get used to it. So the first day of going back isn't the first day they've actually seen the school. Deal with your own anxiety, we've already talked about that. Be reassuring, but limit excessive reassurance. Let me say something about that. Kids, especially with OCD, will ask repeated questions. Is this okay? Is that okay? Is this okay? Am I going to be hurt? Did I check it enough times? Did I write this correctly? When you reassure them too much, then what happens is that then they become dependent on your reassurance. And if you're not there to reassure them, they can't function. So what you want to do is help them answer the questions themselves. So again, reassure, hey, we're doing everything that we can, and we just have to wait. We just have to give it some time. Some parents, when they have kids with OCD, will limit the number of questions to say, okay, because I have some kids who will ask maybe 40 questions in an hour because it's constant. So what you can do is, okay, you get 10 questions an hour. So you decide how many, what questions you're going to ask and when. So that's limiting their ability, which sort of forces them to rely on their own forces. But some of it also is just asking them, put the question back on them. So what do you think about that? Do you think that it's safe to go outside, or do you think it's safe to go up to that other child and say hello? Well, how can you handle it? It's like you're reassuring, but you're actually asking the child to come up with the responses. That tends to work better. Focus on what you're doing to stay safe. I think that provides some realistic reassurance, to be able to explain, hey, this is what we're doing. We're disinfecting our knobs when we come back. We're washing our hands when we get home after going to the store, things like that. So that they know. It actually gives kids a sense of control, noticing the safety measures that they're using, including mask wearing. I find with the kids, I don't know what your experience is, all the kids that we have coming into our office, nobody complains about the masks. The little kids are just fine. The adults are the ones that seem to have more problems with it sometimes. But again, kids, I think, a little bit more malleable and influenceable. And actually, they got some cool looking masks. So anything you can make it a little bit cool or interesting makes it easier for them as well. Some more parenting tips. Keep talking. This is not a one-time thing, so you want to check in with your kids repeatedly and also let them know when you're answering some of their questions and say, hey, if there's anything else that you want to ask me about that's on your mind, just let me know. But you also may need to check in with them. A lot of times, sometimes kids are more open, like when you're tucking them in bed at night, to say, hey, is there anything on your mind that you wanted to talk about? Some parents will find that if they're in the car, especially with the teenagers, and it's just the two of you, and you ask some questions there, sometimes a conversation goes better that way. So something to think about. Limit and monitor news and media exposure. And that's true with any kind of traumatic situation, whether it's protests in the streets. Again, those are scaring kids as well. So you want to limit it. And if they do see it, because again, they're going to see some of this, to try to explain what's going on in a way that helps them feel a little bit more secure. You don't want to inflame their anxiety. Making alternative childcare plans. This is something that I came across. I hadn't really even thought about that, but it's probably not a bad idea. For example, especially if you're in a high-risk activity, it's good to have a plan ahead of time. What would happen? Who's going to take care of your kids if you are not available because you are sick or need to be quarantined or, God forbid, hospitalized? So if you have those plans available, sometimes it's helpful to actually share that with kids. I remember my parents told me if anything happened to them, I was going to go to my favorite aunt and uncle. I said, oh, okay, that'll be all right, because I like being with them. Managing your own stress. I can't emphasize enough the importance of that. There's a lot on every parent these days. It is overwhelming. So it's important to manage your own stress. And part of that involves lowering your expectations. If you've got 3 kids at home and they're all on different screens, it's really hard to keep them, focused. Are they going to learn as much this year? Maybe not. But try not to obsess yourself too much about it. You do what you can. We'll make it up one way or another. It's important to take breaks. Connecting with your own support system. Family Zoom calls can be good. Going out for walks, of course. That also helps the kids get more exercise. And take time to have some fun. That is, I would say, that's as important as anything else. So some ways of starting the conversation with kids. So these are just some things you can say. You have to come up with your own wording and what you think would be effective in your own particular situation. So to say something like, hey, COVID-19 can be a confusing thing to understand. Do you have any questions about it? Or ask them, hey, what do you know about this? What have you heard about it? What concerns do you have? Sometimes you have to ask more specifically. Some people get mad, sad, or worried when thinking about COVID-19. Are you having any of those feelings? How do you feel about wearing masks and social distancing? How do you feel about doing school virtually? I find, and I'm sure you guys can have this experience as well, some kids are loving it. It's like, I love being able to do school from my bed. I just got my laptop here, I do it, I don't have to get dressed, I can do it in my PJs. Some kids are good with that. Some kids really hate it because it's so hard to stay focused. I find for myself when doing therapy sessions, and I was telling people earlier, it's probably about half of them are in person now at our office and about half of them are remote. And it's a lot more tiring to look at a screen for hours at a time, not be able to get up and walk around. So I think a lot of kids are having trouble with it as well as parents. So again, to ask how they feel about it and maybe to ask them, okay, what are some things you can do to help yourself? Is there anything I can do to be helpful with your feelings? To explain if you want them to go for walks and things like that. Everybody's probably sick of walks by now. I know that bikes have been sold out for a while. There's a lot of people who were not able to go on vacations this summer. But to talk about what you can do to help yourself. And it may be making some time to play games, things like that, board games, etc. One thing I want to say about video games and social media, we do know that from research that it's not good to be on these devices all the time. And for some kids, they get so addicted to it, they just can't seem to put it down. And what happens is that when it's time to put it down, to have dinner or to do schoolwork, you get a meltdown. At the same time, I think they've been a godsend, you know, because if you can't play with your friends, but you can play with them doing video games, I think that's, excuse me, I think it's been helpful because that's how they stay connected to their friends. And I have a lot of kids who are concerned about that. I think the kids who are online with their friends, whether they're chatting, gaming, whatever, they tend to do better because peer relationships are so important as they get older. So you may want to relax those rules a little bit. What I usually tell parents is if they've taken care of their basic responsibilities, they've done their schoolwork, they've done their chores, and maybe gotten some exercise, if they want to spend the rest of the time, you know, doing gaming or talking to friends or whatever, you know, I think that's okay because their mental health is important as well. People need to be out there. These are some just general strategies for helping your anxious child in general. Letting kids know that help is available. I think a lot of kids are pretty familiar with counseling as help. A lot of the kids tell me that they know their friends are in counseling or have anxiety or ADHD or what, and it's nice to have kids being a little bit more open with each other. Because if you know your friends are suffering with something similar, it doesn't feel so bad. And knowing that, again, they get better and that we have things that we can try. It's important to participate in a child's treatment. If your child is in therapy, make sure that you're part of the process. There are some therapists who basically just work with the kids. And I don't think that's always the best thing because you're with them more for a far longer time than we are. So I think it's really important to include parents in sessions, which I do all the time. The only exception to that might be teenagers, where I'm less likely to spend time with the parents. But even then, I'd say at least some of the time I check in with parents for every session. Expressing feelings appropriately. So one of the things you want to do with kids is you don't want to just shut down feelings, like whether they're talking to you, whether they're talking to their siblings. Yes, often it comes across as disrespectful. If you just tell them, don't talk to me that way, or don't be disrespectful, you're not actually teaching them anything. So one of the things you can do when you have kids who are expressing their feelings not the best of ways is say, hey, I understand you're really angry at me about this, but calling me names or yelling at me is not okay. I'm not yelling at you, and I don't want you to yell at me. If you can bring it down a few notches and express your feelings a little bit more calmly, we can talk about it. And that way you give a child a chance to just tone it down a little bit, because then that way that keeps the conversation going. If the child is too upset about things to talk about, you say, hey, listen, it looks like you're too upset for us to talk about it, and your yelling is hurting my ears. Why don't we both take a time out? You know, you just chill out for a little bit, I'll do the same. Let's come back in about 15 minutes and try this again. And that's a good thing, because if you teach kids to do that, they can start doing it for themselves. I mean, I've had kids who told me, their parents tell me, yeah, he knows how to put himself in timeout now, not as a punishment, but as a break. To say, I'm going to go in my room and calm down right now. That's awesome when kids are able to do that. Because if you think of that, if a child can take ownership and responsibility for that coping strategy, they're going to do fine as they get older, because they recognize that they're getting upset and they're trying to be constructive instead of destructive. Teaching coping strategies, but asking first. What I mean by this is that some parents, and this is, I think, just normal parenting, if a child comes to you with a problem you want to solve it, so you just tell them what they should do. And that doesn't always go so well, because often they resist that, because most people really don't like being told what to do. I don't like it. I'm guessing some of you don't either. So ask, to say, hey, I can see that you're really struggling with this. Would you like some suggestions on how to help? See you struggling with your homework. Would you like some suggestions, or would you like some help? And then to try to give them just as much help as they need to get them over the hump, not to do it for them. And I find that if you ask kids this, they're more open, they're more likely to listen to you if you've asked their permission. And if you think about it, it's pretty respectful of kids when you're asking them if they need help, because you're not forcing it on them. Providing structure and reasonable limits. Most people and most kids do better with structure. So if they know that school is during these hours, if they know this is playtime, if they know this is dinner time and bedtime, as much as possible, try to come up with something like that. I know that in real life that doesn't happen. You know, things come up, you know, you get stuck in traffic or whatever, but to try to do it as much as you can, and include your child as well. That if there's a problem in terms of the structure, and you have like a family meeting and you sit everybody down and say, okay, we're having trouble here, chores aren't getting done, or dinner's ending up being late, let's work together and come up with some solutions. And ask the kids, hey, what do you think we should do about this? Because if the kids come up with ideas, they're more likely to go along with them. I think that's true in just so many areas. The reasonable limits, and that's where you can set the limits in terms of screen time. I think having limits is appropriate, but again, it depends on the particular person. Again, if somebody can't go outside and there's nobody to play with and they've done all their responsibilities, I don't think it's so damaging to have them have more game time, as long as they can be respectful about it, as long as they can turn it off when their time is up, and not have a fit about it. And you guys may have some thoughts about that, so I'd love to hear those during the question time. Getting help for yourself if you need it, maintaining positive attitude. I've already covered most of these things. Let me talk a little bit about incentives. So normally you don't think of incentives when it comes to anxiety, but sometimes it can be helpful. Let me give you an example. For kids who are afraid to sleep by themselves, I can think of one particular person I worked with, and I just thought about it off the top of my head, and I said, he was having trouble waking up his parents and whatnot, and I said, well, what if you could earn something for sleeping in your own bed? And he looked at me and said, well, what do you mean? I don't know. What if your parents paid you $1 a night to sleep on your own? Ah, yeah, I can see that. And within a couple of days, he had the problem solved. He was so motivated by that money, it helped him. And what happens is that it's not just about the money, but when you're sleeping in your own bed repeatedly, then your bed no longer becomes a scary place. So now you're associating with sleep. And then you can just sort of phase out that incentive once the child has mastered that. But again, you got to ask the child. Sometimes giving them incentives for if they can be by themselves for a certain amount of time at home, then maybe you get to play with them, maybe they earn some tickets or tokens, however you want to do that. It's important not to overschedule. Free playtime is important. Sometimes I think parents see that as like a waste of time, but the way kids deal with their stress is through play. And we adults are supposed to talk about it and are hopefully better at talking about it, but kids have a harder time. So keeping on that free time play is really important. Monitor exposure to screens, we've already talked about that. When professional help is needed. So when these kind of strategies are not enough, if you have some self-help stuff, I mean, one of the things I have with the What to Do When You're Scared and Worried book that I wrote a number of years ago is try some of those strategies with kids at home. Sometimes they'll look at the book and they'll say, oh yeah, I think I have generalized anxiety because I can relate to these symptoms. And then there's some exercises in there that you can do with your parents. For some kids, you work on it and that really is enough. Or some of the strategies, like I said, that I've suggested here during the talk. But when those are not enough, or when the symptoms are severe enough, affecting functioning, their self-esteem suffers. If you have somebody who's so anxious that they can't handle any social situation, they feel more and more isolated, and they feel bad and feel hopeless, and like nothing will ever change, then that's what will trigger depression. So that's something to look at. If it's contributing to other mental health disorders, those are reasons, again, to seek help. Ask for referrals for child therapists. Not everybody out there works with kids. Some say they do, but they don't always. So ask how they operate. Make sure that you're comfortable with their way. As I said earlier, some people do only meet with the child. Some prefer to meet with parents. Some therapists will do play therapy. I don't do so much play therapy now. With kids who have a harder time being verbal, sometimes I'll do that. But the problem with play therapy is you can meet weekly for months, and you may or may not see progress with that. So you want to get a sense of what your child is working on and what you should be doing in between sessions to help them. Meeting with a pediatrician to rule out physical causes. I mentioned panic attacks earlier. That's one of the situations where it probably would be helpful to see the pediatrician just to rule things out. That can be reassuring to kids, and certainly you don't want to overlook what could be a physical cause for something like a panic attack or racing heart, things like that. So treatment options. Cognitive behavioral therapy is where we try to change thoughts about a situation that leads to behavioral changes. So instead, if you go from thinking, hey, they're not going to like me, to, hey, I'm just going to do my best, and I'm a nice kid, so if I go up to somebody else and meet them, chances are they're going to like me as well. So if you change your thinking about that, that can be helpful. I'm going to skip psychodynamic therapy. That talks about like situations between parents and kids that may be contributing to the problem. For example, if there's a lot of stress on the parents, the kids may be experiencing that. Family systems actually speaks to that a little bit more. So there may be situations where you have an older or younger sibling that takes a lot of time and effort for the parents, where the other children feel neglected. And that's a difficult thing because I mean, some kids do take a lot more monitoring. Neurofeedback. The research on that is mixed. Neurofeedback involves you basically hook your brain up to a video screen and you're trying to train your brain to produce the brain waves that you're supposed to produce when you're trying to relax. And you actually can change the way in which your brain operates that way. We don't know as if it really leads to lasting improvement. I can't say that I've had anybody personally that I think's gotten a lot better with neurofeedback when it comes to anxiety. It's used more frequently for ADHD, but it's something to consider. And it's not medicine, and so some people are very hesitant to do that. With medication, we have a lot of kids, since we have 2 psychiatrists at our office now, we see a lot of kids who are on medication. And I know a lot of parents are hesitant about that, which is why we try to do counseling first. We try these other strategies first with kids, and sometimes that's enough. But when it's not enough, medication can make a huge difference. I can tell you a number of cases where I've seen kids as middle schoolers or elementary schoolers who are having so much trouble, not able to go to school, not able to be with friends. And when you see them on medication and stable, and it's just so gratifying for them to come through the office as teenagers and say, yeah, I'm doing okay, I'm on the soccer team, or I'm going to college next year and I'm really excited about it, from somebody who maybe was afraid to leave the house or interact with anybody. So sometimes medication can be really helpful. So don't rule it out. But generally, unless the problem is severe and where you need really more immediate intervention, we generally try therapy first. Hospitalizations, A treatment, things like that. Kids with anxiety, we don't generally hospitalize them. Usually kids who are hospitalized these days are kids who are suicidal, homicidal. If they're on medication and we don't know exactly what's going on and we need to take them off of medication, sometimes that can be helpful as well. But that's, again, for anxiety, that's a pretty rare thing. All right, so before I get in, here's some resources here. The CDC and Johns Hopkins University, those are probably one of the 2 better sites for information. There's graphs, there's videos, and you can really look at different states and even by county. You look at the Virginia Daily Dashboard. I put some Virginia links here for information. Prince William County has its own coronavirus website. The Mayo Clinic, special needs children. I didn't really talk too much about this, but obviously kids with special needs, whether it's intellectual disability, autism, etc., those kids are going to suffer more. That's why with some of the special needs kids, we're trying to get them to school because they really need somebody with them to learn. But obviously that's not appropriate for everybody, especially if you have any kind of chronic illness at home where that's a risk. But that's a link there. It gives you some ideas, specific ideas for helping kids with special needs. UNICEF site there, COVID-19 parenting tips. So I've got a 15-page handout, and it really provides a good summary of some of the things we've been talking about and different things you can do to help kids. And then how to talk to your anxious child or teen about coronavirus. This is from Mental Health America, and that's a good resource as well. Here's some anxiety resources. These are some of the popular self-help books for kids, teens, parents, and caregivers. They've all got websites. You can get on their mailing list for free catalogs. As I said earlier, the more self-help you can provide to kids so they understand what's going on, why they have anxiety and what they can do about it, the better off they're going to be. Here's my contact information, my email address, my website. On my website, you have links for the other books that I've written, as well as podcasts that I've given, talks I've given previously. So if you're interested, feel free to check out my website. The CFCC website is our office website. That also has a number of links for information and some self-help resources for mental health, addiction, educational, and so on. So feel free to look at that as well. So I know I've thrown a lot of information here at you. I hope you have some questions or comments as to what you're seeing and maybe some specific situations that might be helpful. But we will get through this eventually. We've got a lot of reasons to be optimistic. And I know that it's hard for people with anxiety. They want a clear solution. They want to know exactly when it's going to get better. And living with uncertainty is tough, but unfortunately that's part of life. So if we can help convey that lesson and that it's okay not to know, and that you have to find ways to distract yourself, to live with it, and to continue to pursue things that make you happy. I think it's a really important life lesson to learn. All right. So, any questions?
Any questions? Enter them in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Chris.
You're very welcome. I threw a lot of information out there. Maybe give people a couple more minutes if they want to ask, or can you do it so that people can ask verbally if they want to?
Kayla, will you do that?
Yes, if somebody's interested in asking a question verbally, if you just want to put in the chat that you'd like to do that, then we can definitely unmute you.
Quiet group today.
It
Maybe
looks like
already answered everybody's question.
Janelle has a question here. I'm going to send you a request to unmute Janelle.
Dr. Chris, I had a question. I want to know, there was two types of parenting you said for people like who have different needs, who are having anxiety. I was wondering what they were, and if we can go back into that. And the other thing is, for what you were just showing, like one of your last two slides about the different like anxiety, the different ways parents can help them. I was wondering, can you go over that again, please? So
Sure. Repeat your first question. I didn't quite catch your first question.
different types of like, I think there's like a parenting or something you were saying about some kind of parenting, or like what the parents could do to, like, you know, when they're like speaking to the kid and helping the kid to realize like it's okay, but just don't, you know, be disrespectful, understand what the parents are saying or trying to do for the kid, and the resources, just the way they help the kid when they are having different types of anxiety or panic attacks.
Yeah, so what you need to do, again, parents can set that example, help reflecting when they see their kids having trouble to say, hey, I can see that you're really worried about it. Can you tell me a little bit about how you're feeling? I was also talking about asking if they would like some suggestions. Sometimes kids just need a hug. Do you say, hey, do you need a hug? Are you feeling like you just need a little bit of affection right now? And sometimes that's all they need. They feel a little bit more understood and they move on. So I think also that it's really important for parents to kind of
And
monitor
some of
that.
this, I kind of have like my anxiety, and I've kind of been like the same way. Like how you said, like they can go into school, try it out before they go into the school. They are having like a hard time fitting in or going in there, because like I've had my issues similar when I was in school, and I was kind of in little special ed classes too, but little regular.
I think that's where
I'm
you can
out of
use,
school now. I've been out of school for a while.
yeah, that's where you can use your own experience to be helpful to kids, to say, hey, I had some similar problems when I was your age, so I can understand that that's really tough. And sometimes if you can tell some stories about what your own experience was, again, your child feels less alone. And if they're coming up with, if they're asking you questions, like I said, that you don't know the answer to, it's okay to say, I really can't answer that. I don't know exactly what's going to happen with school. You know, for kids to learn how to accept the things they can't change, and to control the things that they can. They can't control when school's going to be back in session, but they can control making sure that they go to bed on time, making sure they get enough exercise, making sure they eat a healthy diet. So you focus on things that they can do that would be helpful.
And Janelle, I'll be sending out these slides to everybody too.
Okay.
All his slides, so you'll get a copy of them. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you, Ms. Jan. I appreciate your session, Dr. Chris. This was a great session. I learned a lot, and I really like it. It was really informative.
I appreciate that.
Anybody else?
Dr. Chris, Kelly says that she sent you a private question regarding sleep. And then we have another question that we can do after that if you would like.
Okay, I see the question. Is, I assume it's okay to answer in front of everybody? Those private. So
yes, that's fine. Thank you.
yeah. So with regard to sleep, again, there's more anxiety going on in all over the world here. So one of the things that you'll see with kids is they might be more inclined to want to sleep with parents. They may be more afraid to sleep with them by themselves. And so what I look at is just how is it affecting the family function? What I find is that some of the kids, they go into each other's beds. And so you're always sleeping with your little brother. I says, well, does that help you get through the night? Sure. So even if like you have an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old, if they like sleeping in the same bed or in the same room, and that helps them, not a problem. The way I think it's sort of a modern day thing where we think every child has to have his or her own bedroom. we forget for the majority of our time here on Earth, people lived in one or two, room places. They didn't have a separate spaces. So some of the anxiety I think kids are having is probably just natural. So I think of my grandparents, and there were 7 of them, and they all slept in one huge bed because they didn't have the money for anything else. So, and they all seemed to turn out fine. When it comes to sleeping with a parent or requiring you to go in there to lie with them before they fall asleep, again, you have to think about how that all goes. Sometimes we'll help kids sleep by themselves gradually. For example, I can think of a parent this week says, okay, you have to stay in your own bed, but if it's after midnight and you're still afraid, then you can come in. Some parents will say, okay, you can come into our bedroom if you're afraid, but you got to sleep on a cot or something on the floor because you don't want them to get too comfortable. Sometimes it works if a parent stays in their room with them until they fall asleep. So what you want to try to do is just gradually kind of wean them off of it. Sometimes a nightlight works well. Sometimes keeping the door open works well. Sometimes I will have kids give them like a little flashlight or a book reading light by their bed so that they can do something. Say, okay, if you wake up at night and you're afraid, what can you do? Some kids will listen to music and that helps. Some kids have white noise. Sometimes kids will read for a little bit and that calms them down. So we're trying to give them coping strategies, but expect that there's probably going to be more of that now. There's going to be more fears now. And if you think about it in the dark, you really don't want to know what's in there. I have a kid who told me recently, I have a large closet. I'm really not sure who might be living. I don't believe in monsters. I'm not entirely sure if there's somebody in there. So talk about whether you keep the closet door open or closed or whether they have lights in there. So I guess what I'm saying also is just problem solve with your child to say, here's the issue. Here are some possible ways we can handle this. So hopefully if I answered that question, feel free to ask a follow-up.
No, that helps. It's a long-standing issue, and it's just gotten exponentially worse. And it's not, my gut is this isn't really the time to try to make a big change.
Yes, no, I think you're right. And also, usually you're not going to have teenagers wanting to sleep with you, right? By that point, they're more wanting to have their own space. So it's a problem that will eventually resolve itself. But
Thank you.
this is probably not the time to do it. How do you teach nonverbal children to handle anxiety, especially when it's impacted their routine to regulate their energy? It's really, really tough. I think for them, that they don't know how to respond to it, that's where you're probably going to need external things. And it may be, whether it's using an iPad or watching something or using fidgets. A lot of the kids will use fidgets to try to help themselves with their own anxiety. With them, also, it's going to be important to kind of monitor them more carefully, just so if you can see evidence of, more irritability. I think that's one of the things you might see more in kids in general, but also that you might observe it in nonverbal kids. You see them struggling with that. So if there's anything you can do to help keep their routine a little bit more stable, sometimes you can use visual aids. So it could be that there's different cards that you have for different things that are happening. So maybe it's time to have a snack, you put a card that has food on it, or if there's time to do some work, if they can do some work, you put that on as well. So visual aids sometimes help provide some structure as opposed to just saying it yourself, and especially if they have a hard time responding. So again, you have to do the best you can, and recognizing that not everything is going to be always the same. And that's true. You think of kids with autism. Kids with autism they really get anxious when things aren't structured, when there's anything that's a little bit different. And so a lot of times parents will go out of their way to try to keep everything the same, but that's not life. Things sometimes are going to be different. So that's one of the, you look at it, that you can teach a child the skill of handling disruptions in routine and acknowledging, hey, I know that you're really expecting this and plans change, and I know that's really tough for you. So what are some ways that you could deal with this that makes it a little bit easier? So you're introducing that a little bit at a time and acknowledging that life isn't always going to be perfect. It's not always going to go according to plan. Other questions?
There's a number of thank yous, and mine included. I'm sure Rhonda feels the same way. So, anything else?
I actually have one more follow-up question. Sorry, I'm not Zoom camera ready this morning. I'm just being honest, Friday with kids at home in school, homeschool, of course. You mentioned a little bit about play therapy if you're looking at professional help for your child. And I wondered if you could expand a little bit. Again, we're looking an age I would be proposing discussion, I would be around 10. And it sounded like, was it that it's better for younger or just it takes longer for everyone? I just wondered if you would mind expanding on that a little.
Okay, so I was trained to do play therapy, so I know the routine. And the theory behind play therapy is that if kids' way of communicating is play, then the way in which you help them resolve their issues is through play as well. When they become more comfortable, they can do some role playing, trying different things. Sometimes play therapy is helpful when you're doing it in conjunction with other activities. The idea being if kids are busy playing, it makes it easy for them to talk. So it's sort of a distraction. So I might play a board game of Connect Four or whatnot, and we might be talking about other situations or feelings as we're playing it. I see a lot of kids who have done play therapy and the parents haven't been really happy about it because either they don't see much change or they're not getting enough feedback from the therapist. So I usually try to start with more talk therapy. Even a 5 or 6 year old, it's surprising the things that they're able to tell me about what's going on in practicing deep breathing or whatnot. And if I can give them some skills to learn and practice, and that's enough to deal with the problems, then I'm going to go with that. Other kids may have more significant problems where that's not enough or they're not really open to that. And so then we may go to play therapy as a way of helping them feel more comfortable and working through issues. So let me give you an example. Play therapy where maybe you're working with like action figures or dolls, and if the play therapist can sort of talk about the feelings. Hey, I wonder what this guy's feeling when he's doing this. Okay, so they're fighting here. How about this guy? What does he think? Okay, is there anything else he could do that might make it a little bit better? So then we'll use the play as a way of teaching some things. So I think play therapy can be useful. The main complaint I hear from parents, like I said, is that they don't get much feedback and that it can go on forever. Whereas my thought in terms of therapy is I only want kids to be in therapy long enough to deal with their problems. I will have kids that I work with who don't like therapy. And so we talk about what it's going to take to convince their parents they don't need to come to therapy anymore. It could be sleeping in their own bed. It could be getting chores done. It could be, handling, getting great or being cooperative when it comes to getting homework done. So we'll set those specific goals so that they don't always have to be in therapy forever. Whereas play therapy can go on for a much longer period of time. And I'm not sure at one point you really know when it's over. But some kids get better. For some kids, it works so well and you do visual play therapy and the parents will report, he seems to be a lot happier and we're not having some of those problems. So I think that's fine. So it's really, it's about what works.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Anybody else?
My thing also is like for any kids, even if I was like in a situation where it was risky and it's hard for me to just speak up about someone having a conversation with me, my thing is like even for other kids that are younger, amount of age, like how can they better be accustomed to that issue or help reduce about having fear, anxiety, and the psychological testing others done with those people who are going through all those disorders. How can they, as they get older, deal with it and learn from, not just learn from it, but handle a situation without it becoming a problem? Because I think you went into that a little bit.
In terms of, say the beginning part of that again?
Like when they're going through like their psychological testing and they have like either anxiety or depression or autism or any of our panic attacks, what can they do when they're having that? And whether they're young or older or in their teens and they're trying to better handle the situation, even with something with their parents, and they get into something that goes wrong with an argument. How come when learning from that, what can they do?
Got it. So one of the things that we sometimes will do is come up with a list of coping strategies. For example, when you're feeling anxious, when you're feeling sad, what What are some things you can do to make yourself feel better? Sometimes I'll have kids and we'll use index cards and we'll each come up with different thoughts. And so, okay, it might be hug a stuffed animal. It might be have a snack. It might be do some jumping jacks. It might be asking for a hug from parents. And so then when they're struggling, they can actually just look through the cards and say, okay, these are some things I could try that might be helpful to me. If they're having a panic attack, one of the things that they have to learn is to label it, to say, when you're having a panic attack, one of the things you need to do is just tell yourself, okay, I'm having a panic attack. This is really unpleasant, but it's not going to hurt me, and I just have to wait it out. Because sometimes with panic attacks, if you fight it, it makes it worse. You have to look at it sort of like a wave. You let it rush over your body and then gradually calm yourself down. And some kids can learn to do that with practice. With deep breathing, as I mentioned earlier, that's definitely something that kids can practice. But you need to practice that as a skill. It's not something you can just start deep breathing when you're in a situation.
And
You've
part
got
of
to train
part of my question is when they excuse yourselves or take yourselves to the room and even like with the COVID, how they're feeling because they're dealing with it and them getting upset or those things you were mentioning, and separating them apart from whoever is giving them a hard time. What's another way for them to, after disclosing how they feel, to not just only distance themselves from a situation, but to make them feel better about what you're going through in COVID?
Yeah, so with something like that, again, you can have a series of coping strategies. For some kids, just reading a book. It could be playing a video game. It could be drawing, coloring. There's a lot of different things. It could be going for a walk. So I think a lot of it is just specific as to the child, what the child enjoys doing. So if you get them to do other things that help them feel better, things that they enjoy. Sometimes when you have kids who are anxious about something and they have like their favorite funny video, and they can cue that up so they can watch their favorite funny video and it makes them laugh. Sometimes if you can get somebody to laugh about something, it somehow breaks the spell. Because laughter, making something funny, is a higher level brain function. And if you engage that part of them, then it's easier for them to sort of bring down things. Like even kids who are getting really angry, it's like, okay, we're having an argument. We both have to wear funny hats. So the parent puts on a funny hat, the kid puts on a funny hat. Now you're gonna have the same argument. And you're trying to argue, and then you just sort of break down laughing because it's so ridiculous. Or even if you're having an argument or something, you could like sing. You can sing your complaints. Or even if a parent's responding to a child by singing, sometimes it's almost like you're trying to be goofy a little bit on purpose to sort of break the spell. Sometimes that can be useful.
Because I've had like a friend of mine before, is a girl, and she came up to me and she would text me like she's having issues for a parent, and that's why I was just like always trying to help her, and then she had to move on with that. But then I was trying to help her like how you can handle a situation, like if it's because you're not doing enough work at home or you're dealing with a situation with your parents, and that's why I'm based on what you were talking about certain things, I'm trying to like evaluate that. So if there's other types of situations that I may not know and they come to me, I can better help them in the way you provide the information.
So one of the things you can do is teach kids how to talk to their parents. Actually, there's a book that was written a while back. It's called Bringing Up Parents. And I find kids pretty open to that. And also we will do this in family therapy. So if a child's having a problem, the parent can even ask the child, how would you like me to respond if you are doing this? The child can say to the parent, Mom, if you're really upset with me about something, could you just say it more calmly? Or leave me a note, because if you say it more calmly, I'm going to hear it better. So you come up with an agreement as to how to address a problem. That way you're making the communication go more smoothly. Because if you can make the communication work more smoothly, that problem starts to resolve itself. So they don't necessarily need to come into me to deal with it once we teach them effective communication skills. Here's another example. I'm going to go to anger because I think that's, in terms of what I see, anger is probably the hardest thing for parents and kids to deal with. So to be able to say to kids, I really want to hear what you're upset about, but the way you're doing it now is hurtful. Or to take a time out and to have that be something that a parent can do or a child can do. For example, it's okay for a parent to say, I'm too angry to talk to you right now. If I talk to you now, I'm going to say something mean and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to go to my room and we'll talk later. That's a very good example, I think. What do you think?
Okay, I think that's good. Would you advise you're giving everybody about that topic, and I appreciate what you're saying, and I will definitely use that. Like if I need to, for anyone that has a question in regards to those things. So even for myself when I'm in a situation, because I had something I was going through the other day, and it was like with a family member. So I was just glad that you brought those things up.
Yeah, sure. In the handouts, you have my email address. So if you have a question or needing a resource,
can you just tell could you put in have someone like if Miss Jane could email me like your contact your information or your website, because I can't remember it right now.
It's on the slides that I'll be sending out, and I think it's the last slide.
Yes.
So you'll get that information, Janelle.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. Well, I think that's it for today. Thank you so much, Dr. Chris.
You're very welcome. Thanks to everybody for coming and participating and listening. I hope you have a good rest of your day and weekend, and things do get better. So it's life. Everything has life left.
I even feel better after this, so.
Yeah. Same here.
So everybody have a great day. Thank you. I hope you join us for some of our future workshops coming up. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.